Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. Shame is debilitating. It ruins relationships, thwarts growth, and destroys hope. It can masquerade as various problems: guilt, envy, pride, resentment, but until you heal the core issue, freedom will remain out of reach. Dr. Mark Baker has received a PhD in clinical psychology and a master's degree in theology, as well as a certificate in psychodynamic psychotherapy. He serves as the executive director of the Rabbi Counseling Centers in Pasadena and Santa Monica, California. He's the author of several books, including Jesus, the Greatest Therapist to Ever Live, which has sold more than 2 million copies. And he joins us on the second Friday of every month at the 12 o'clock hour, and he's the author of Overcoming Shame, Let Go of Others' Expectations, and Embrace God's Acceptance. He joined us here now, Dr. Mark Baker, to talk about shame in this season. Dr. Mark Baker, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Eric, it's always good to be with you. I always look forward to our conversations.
As do I, my friend, and it's just a delight to have you with us. What's going on in our nation today, and what's been going on for the last 3.5 years, is the weaponization of shame. Shame is being weaponized on a national and really on a global basis. That the dredging up of past offenses, past atrocities, past history of every nation in the world is being dredged back up in the form of tearing down any icons of history, any message of history, any reminder of history, forgetting what God says, which He says, there's things I want you to do in remembrance of me. Well, as we apply that into the world, and I'm going to ask you to turn your speakers down just a little bit. We're getting a little bit of feedback. As we look at some of these reminders, in Judaism, we celebrate Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust remembrance, with the message that if we do not remember, it will happen again. Things that we did as a nation, if we erase it from our memory, if we're shamed into blotting it out, we will repeat it again.
Right.
Europe is in that cycle where it's being repeated. The former Soviet Union is in that cycle where it's being repeated. China is in that cycle where it's being repeated. And people are being motivated by the minority voice is a militant agenda to suppress my rights by imposing and inflicting their rights by using shame as the key to unlock the door to making me feel bad enough that I will conform and comply to their agenda for fear of being further shamed.
Right. I think that's accurate.
How do we process that?
Well, it is very difficult, and it's difficult for you and I to even have this conversation without being accused of being racist for having the conversation. So where do we start? I think we have to try to push ahead and have these conversations anyway, even though for fear of the consequences. I think this is the only way we can bring healing, is through conversation like this. I agree with you. What I'm seeing just 2 blocks from my house is a major intersection. And when we drive by that intersection, there are people still standing there today with signs screaming at people as they drive by. My wife and I were driving by yesterday, and a man holding a sign saying, "Defund the police," was screaming at us, angry, a young 20-something Caucasian guy, screaming at our car, furious. And my wife saying, "Why is he so mad at us?" She looks at me, what have we done? And what I see when I see that is unhealed trauma. Here's someone who's triggered for some reason in his past, has some historical injury there that has left its scars of shame in his life, that's causing him to stand on a street corner and scream out in rage at people driving by, and not even really, I think, knowing what he's angry about. He's pretty certain. Uh, and a few days ago on our local news, we saw people demonstrating, and they were lining up against what was the National Guard. They were lined up, and there were people holding signs, much like this young man, screaming at the National Guard, furious with rage in their face. And the news reporter went up to, it was 3 or 4 different protesters, and these people weren't violent; they were protesting. And the news reporter put a mic in their face and said, obviously you're trying to create change here. What is it that you would like to see changed? And none of them had an answer. Each of them would say things like, well, I'm just doing my part, or well, that's for the legislators to decide, or that's for other people. I'm just out here doing my part. So wait, step back. Wait, you're extremely angry. You're very furious, and you don't know what you're asking for. You know things need to change. You don't know what needs to change or how it needs to change. Okay, now my reaction as a psychologist, I take a step back and go, okay, that person has unhealed hurt, shame, trauma, and they're screaming out because they've been given an opportunity to scream. It's now okay, but they don't really know why they're screaming. They would say, oh, it's racism in America, it's systemic racism, and it's institutional racism, and that's the phrase they'll say. But then when you ask them, well, then what is it that you would like to see change? What specifically? Legislation? What would you like? Most of them don't have an answer. Now that says to me we've got a deeper psychological problem going on. Yes, we have an issue with race relations, clearly. I had one of my therapist's husband stopped and asked to get out of his car at gunpoint this week because he was driving a nice car and he was a black man. Yes, that did happen. Now, I don't know what went on earlier that day in the lives of those officers to make them do this, because we have rioting going on around us. But he did do that. That was racial profiling. It was very frightening for this young man, who's a very decent Christian man. So does that exist? Yes, it exists, right. And we want to be able to sit down and have conversation to bring healing for those very real problems that are going on. But this is not doing it. I think the rage for me, rage, that kind of, we call it narcissistic rage, but it's just rage. Rage is in reaction to something. There's always a trigger underneath it. And the trigger is a more vulnerable emotion that you can only get to when you sit down in conversation. When we sit across the table and we say, okay, what are the offenses? What are the injuries? What are the solutions? Can we talk about what's going on? And if you can't get there, then you're being triggered by your own past trauma, your own past shame that is now so mixed into the subject that we can't have a conversation. We can't sit down and talk about what's going on and what we can do to solve it in any constructive way whatsoever. So I would say yes, sadly, shame has become weaponized and it's become politicized. And it's being used for other agendas to generate rage that is not productive. I think anger can be constructive, absolutely, but this kind of rage blinds us to what's going on underneath. And let me give you another example of what I think is the solution. Here in Los Angeles, there's a church here, Pastor Shep Crawford, pastors a black church out here in LA, and he invited the local police department to bring out their policemen to his church, which is a black church, and sit down one-on-one with each of the members in his church, and they had face-to-face conversations where you're sitting across from a cop. Most of the cops were minorities, and that's a minority area, so they have primarily minority cops, and they were sitting down. It was beautiful to watch this. There was a little bit of it on the news, but you're not going to see that on national news. You have a young teenage black man talking to an officer one-on-one, asking the question, what's going on? How can we make this better? Are you afraid of me? How can we improve our relationship? Now, that's the beginning of healing. where we can sit down and have honest conversations about the hurts, the disappointments, the injuries, the prejudices that are going on, without the rage and the screaming, which is triggered by our own deeper psychological pain that blinds us to an actual productive conversation, to dealing with issues that we really do need to deal with. There are some hard conversations that we do need to have, and we can't get there when we're being told we need to scream at the other because of either the color of my skin or the color of your skin, that we need to scream for that reason. And I think it is sadly keeping us stuck, not moving us forward in the healing of what I do believe are issues that need to be addressed and healed.
You know, we've been in this place before. I was in that place before, in the late 60s, early 70s. I was the vice president of the student body of 55,000 students at Penn State University. Myself and the president, Michael Shields, we orchestrated the taking over of Old Main. We had a sit-in.
Mm-hmm.
We told the people, we came in mass and we sat down in the hallways and we blocked the doorways and we sat in the offices and we took over Old Main, which was where the president and the administration were. And we said, we're not going to leave here until America pulls out of Vietnam. That was the solution. Get us out, bring our boys home, bring our friends home. Don't put us in a position where I have to worry about my lottery number or whether or not I'm going to get a student deferment and go fight a war that's a political agenda that France got us involved in, that has nothing to do with American rights or this country or protecting the domestic tranquility or protecting America from a foreign invasion. It's not World War II. It's not the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor. You're not justified for being there, and the cost of life and these massacres that we're hearing about and what chemicals are being used and what's going on there. We had a mission, we had a message, and we had a solution.
Right.
End the war in Vietnam. Take us out of Laos. Take us out of Cambodia. Take us out of Vietnam. Stop it. Bring it. End this atrocity. That was the message. We marched on Washington. We went to the University of Maryland. We recruited thousands, and then we went to Washington. And you've seen in the movies of all of us gathered there at the Washington Monument. We had a message. It wasn't violent. It wasn't militant. It didn't become violent and militant until it was hijacked by the SDS, Students for Democratic Society, by the Black Panthers, by the White Panthers, okay? Abby Hoffman and that group, and Angela Davis and that group, and Eldridge Cleaver and that group. And so you can go down a long list of agendas that became mixed in that message, and then you find out that all of a sudden the National Guards at Kent State and Allison Krauss, my neighbor, Allison Krauss from Pittsburgh, Jewish girl, is killed. One of the 4 students at Kent State. And that's what happens when violence comes into the picture and tear gas comes into the picture, and then you it incents, it provokes, it pushes, and all of a sudden you get swept up into a hive mentality, and you're not sure because the leaders are clear, but you don't. It's not a control, and so the whole point of that is that you don't want to be controlled by the government, and so you're a leader, and what you want to do is you want to get people on the same page with you, and so you have to lead, and people are inclined to follow the strongest voice, the strongest spirit. Whether or not it's a counterfeit spirit, it's an authentic Holy Spirit, doesn't matter. It's the strongest spirit that people will subject themselves to. We were a strong voice. Michael Shields was an ex-con out of the state penitentiary outside the campus of Penn State for white-collar crime. He had already been in the corporate world. He was doing a stint in a country club prison, was paroled, and became a student. And so here we were with the strongest voice. the strongest spirit, even at 19 years old.
See, and I think that that kind of change has always been needed and still is needed. But you had a very specific idea of what needed to change. You thought there was an institutional problem, and you had very specific ideas of what laws need to change, what decisions need to change. And right at that time, or a little earlier than that, Martin Luther King had the same agenda. There were specific legislation that was racist in our country that needed to change. And he stood in the president's office in 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was signed. He had a very clear idea of what institutional racism was in the United States because it was on the books. And he changed the Equal Opportunity Housing Act and the Voting Rights Act, all in the 60s. This was racist legislation in this country that needed to change. And we had non-violent leaders who were actively, in his case, anti-racist, wanting us to change what was racist in our country. We're in a different age now. Those laws are no longer on the books. Now, there are laws that still need to be changed, the implications of which are harsher for poor, which are disproportionately black. I understand that. But if we need to change that legislation, we need to be very specific about what we're trying to do. And let's address the violence issue. I'm hearing now from several places, well, Martin Luther King didn't go far enough. He was nonviolent. Look where that got us. Nothing has changed. I'm hearing people say that. And I want to say, are you kidding me? There were laws in the United States prohibiting blacks from buying property, prohibiting blacks from voting, prohibiting blacks from doing lots of things. Those laws changed because of nonviolent protesters like Martin Luther King. And he was committed to nonviolence as a change. He modeled himself after Jesus and Gandhi. And that is the most effective vehicle for change. And we're veering off, and I think you said it earlier, because of the weaponization of shame, which shame triggers rage and violence. So that's now feeling legitimate. I'm hearing people say, well, what do you expect? You don't expect people to loot when they've been oppressed for all these years? Wouldn't you expect them to do that? I would say, well, maybe I would expect them, but it's still wrong. It's still illegal. It's still not going to produce change. Martin Luther King's vision was, he said this quite openly. He said, you cannot legislate morality, but what you can do is legislate behavior. And so what he felt is that we need to legislate behavior, and then that when the behavior changes, that gives us the opportunity for men's hearts to be changed. That's what he said. We've legislated the changes and are legislating changes that need to happen, and sometimes that takes anger to do it. I'm sure he was angry at times, but he wasn't violent, he wasn't rageful. Now it's our job to do the changing of hearts. That does not come through violence. You don't change people's hearts, you alienate people with rage and violence. That doesn't draw me towards you. Now, if you're passionately angry about something, but still able to make your argument without attacking me, without violating me, I'm listening. But once you're violating me, I stop listening. It's like I now have to protect myself, and you become not someone I want to dialogue with when violence enters the picture. Aggression is healthy. Violence is not. The difference is, aggression is the force, sometimes physical force, to protect boundaries. This is when Jesus pushed the money changers out of the temple. He was aggressive. John has him with a whip in his hand. Right? That's not passive. That was aggressive because he was saying, you are violating the boundaries. You should not be here. Get back out where you belong. And we need to use aggression to push back bad people from where they are to where they need to be. Get back out where you need to be. So aggressively pursuing our goals is a healthy thing at times. Violence is that same force used not just to protect boundaries, but to violate boundaries. Where I will take that same voice, and not just to protect what's right and good and godly, but actually to violate other people. That violence is not healthy. We show videos to children of other children protecting their boundaries, and children see that, and they don't really have too much of a reaction to it. They think, okay, well, that's okay. This kid tried to take your toy, you protect your toy. Kids seem to be able to assimilate that. When you show videos of children being violent to other children, you know what the children do? They become violent. If I see as a child videos of kids violating the boundaries of the kid, hitting him with toys, as soon as I watch that video, I start hitting some other kid with my toys.
Right.
Violence begets violence. This is what we need to understand, not only as believers, but as people who are trying to deal with very serious issues in our culture today. Violence begets violence. And that the people who say that Martin Luther King was wrong in his approach are wrong. That he modeled himself after the most powerful leader in all of history, the one man who's changed more lives, more cultures, has had more influence than all the governments and all the kings and all the armies on the planet. This one non-violent changer of human relationships and relationship with God, Jesus, taught a non-violent but aggressive approach to change. That's the most effective way to be, the most effective way to affect change. And this notion that violence is sort of necessary because Martin Luther King didn't have the right approach will not turn out well for all of us. And I think it's going to set us back in terms of the race relations issue that we do need to address. As I said, I believe racism and racial profiling and racial prejudices exist. They do exist. We all have our prejudices, all of us do, and we all need to look at those. And I think if we can get to the table, how we will create change is for each of us to examine our own narrative, our own prejudices, our own history, and be honest about that, and then listen to the narrative and the prejudices and the history of the person across the table and create a new narrative together. That comes through this kind of conversation that's honest and self-reflective, at times aggressive but never violent. I think we have a task. The gauntlet's been thrown down for us. It's a challenge for us to respond.
As we look at sociological models and we look at the breakdown in communities and we look at what just the metrics are, that the most violent offenders within the black community are from within the black community.
Right.
That 70%, according to statistics, is black
Right.
on black crime.
Right.
When you introduce that into the narrative, all of a sudden now you're changing. You're kind of it's like when you go to the eye doctor and he says, now we focus. Is this better, A or B, A or B, A or B, and they start dialing it in. When you start focusing in, there is a core problem, and the core problem is a result of a prior core problem.
Right.
That then fomented this problem that exists today. And at the core of it is something that Lady Bird Johnson, who had, wasn't she the one that, about reading, about literacy? Was she the one, or was that Bush? She was Keep America Beautiful.
That was Bush, I think.
I think she was Keep America Beautiful. Bush was reading.
Literacy, yeah, right.
So if we take a look at literacy rates of those institutionalized, you did the study in Angola, right? I know that you encountered the fact that some had learning disabilities, dyslexia, that when they got frustrated with the system because of a learning disability that wasn't diagnosed in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, even in the 80s, maybe even into the 90s, early 90s, before it became something that we could figure out that they had a learning disorder. They didn't see words the way. That it
Right.
brought frustration, and because of that frustration of being felt they were stupid and being shamed, that they wound up being put in positions where, so literacy, 90% of juveniles in the juvenile system have a literacy rate below third grade level, reading rate below third grade level. Their
Right.
parents are functionally illiterate. The parents are functionally illiterate. They can't teach their children to read. So there's no help at home. And the school system is not capable of dragging somebody along through the system. Let no child left behind. We're going to push them through the system even if they can't pass the reading. It's a self it's a snake eating its own tail.
Right.
And we've allowed this, and it is a remnant of a time where we did have the ghettos, and we did have the segregation, and we did have, and this is a remnant of that. And we did not solve the problem by saying that we would have an Equal Rights Act. Okay, now you couldn't discriminate because of race, religion, or national origin. Now it's sexual orientation added to it. But that doesn't mean that that person's going to apply for that job because they don't know that the job's available, because it's not within their core skill set. They're relegated to jobs where you don't have to read. You just take orders. Okay, laying bricks. You don't need to read a manual on laying bricks. You put bricks, you alternate them, and you put mortar in between them. Okay, and if I get really good at it, I can make $30 or $40 an hour. And that's $80,000 a year, and that puts me in that higher echelon. Now I'm a middle class person, I'm a bricklayer, or I'm a truck driver, or I work for the Department of Sanitation, and I have a pension, and I have benefits, and I have a better lifestyle, but I may still not be able to read, but I found a way to work through the system and to get the kind of jobs. But that takes a desire, that takes something instilled, and it takes opportunity and development, and there's an investment that needs to be made, but not out of shame.
Right.
Out of raising the level of the water. And I think we've missed this message societally, that this is not about an individual group, it is about a nation. We need to raise the standard of the nation, the level of the water, so that every boat rises. I remember in 1975 when I moved to Atlanta, I played golf at a particular country club, and I said, wow, this is really a great facility. What's the initiation fee here? And they said, oh, you can't join. I said, what do you mean I can't join? Well, you're Jewish. You have your own country club. You can't be here. This is a no blacks, no Jews. And the PGA came and said to them, listen, like in, I think, 1978, 1979, we'd like to have a tournament here. You've applied for being on the tour, but you have a discriminatory membership policy. You have to take all these, we have, you're saying these black professional golf players now starting to appear in the 70s, okay, on the tour, can't play golf here. Oh, well, they can play here, they just can't be a member. No, you need to change that. And so this was old guard, old school, old deep South. This was a very difficult transition. And there was a lot of pushback, a lot of resentment, right? Because they too had country clubs. Okay? They weren't as nice and they weren't as well funded. But so there was the Jewish country club, there was the black country club, and then there were all these other Gentile. Now, I've said this before, you have never seen an organized protest of Jews who have gathered together and violently protested 5,000 years of Gentile persecution. It's never happened.
No.
And there's been no more persecuted group over the history of mankind. No more division, 3,000 years of division between Jew and Gentile. 3,000 years. Division between Jew and Gentile. Not until Jesus came, not until Paul brought this message, not until God spoke to Peter to go to Cornelius and tore down that middle wall of separation, were the only two people in the Bible. It wasn't black and white, it was Jew and Gentile.
Right.
And this reconciliation that took place between Jew and Gentile meant that God does not see color. He says from the two, that's it. That's all there is in mankind. There's Jew and Gentile. From the two I shall make one new man.
Right.
That doesn't mean you become Jewish and I become Gentile. It means that we become together in the nurturing lifeblood of the Commonwealth of Israel, of this grafting in. It wasn't based on your skin color, it was based on your bloodline, You were either of a Jewish lineage, the line of Messiah, and the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or you weren't. You had nothing to do with it. You had no choice in the matter.
Right.
You had nothing to do with it. So God fixed that problem. He came up with the solution. That no longer was there to be enmity between these two.
Right.
But yet we've continued to allow for this to cycle. And those that would deny are in deception.
Right.
And that, I think, is a part of the problem, is the lack of willingness to, look, I don't remember in my lifetime, and I had Angela Davis to my right side, and I had Abby Hoffman to my left side, okay? Two Jews and a black woman with a big afro, and I had a big afro, and I had a Jewfro, and Abby had a Jewfro, walking together, marching together.
Right.
Okay? We didn't have any issues among ourselves. We saw the issues, but we had reconciliation between us. We weren't mighty whitey, and we were joined together to say, listen, you oppress anybody, you discriminate against anybody, you hold anybody back from opportunity, okay, you're in the wrong.
Right.
Now, if I'm given the opportunity and I don't take advantage of the opportunity, then I've taken personal responsibility that I didn't do better. And so we look and we take the Ben Carsons, and we take the Martin Luther Kings, and we take the individuals that rose up above their circumstance and did something with their life and say, see, if they can do it, you can do it. That's not always the case. But yet we don't recognize where we need an honest dialogue, because we're in this place of shame.
Right.
And shame causes denial. In the show opening, we talked about the various aspects of shame. But in the body of Messiah, and this is where I have an issue, is that I believe that some people are more committed to their sin than they are committed to the Lord. And they've lost their voice. And they're not the voice as a minister of reconciliation and an ambassador of God, that Paul says that anyone who is in Messiah is a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. And we're called into this ministry of reconciliation, as if God was reconciling man to himself and we were reconciling man to God.
Right.
That was the calling of every believer, Jew or Gentile. That was our calling. That was our ministry. That was the first ministry assigned to us by God when we came into faith in Messiah. The very first thing was laid upon our shoulders. We were all ordained to be ministers of reconciliation. But yet we have anti-Semitism in the church. We have racism in the church. It should not be so.
I agree. And I feel very strongly that what's needed now are for us to speak out, but to speak out about the need for the ministry of reconciliation.
Yes.
I think that needs to be our message, to reconcile. And the efforts that went on in the 60s and 70s were profoundly significant, and we made profoundly significant changes, but we are still effecting those changes. We're still doing the changing of the hearts part. Martin Luther King said we've got to change legislation to change behavior, and then hearts will change afterwards. We're still changing the hearts, and that's going to come through reconciliation, not through rage. That's not going to produce the change. And Martin Luther King, I love the stories about this man. He believed in everything you just said, and that's the reason we still acknowledge him as a hero today, because he believed in this reconciliation, that it was not only possible, but it was the way America was intended to be from the beginning. And he didn't hate America and believe America was racist. He walked around carrying a piece of the American flag in his pocket. And so whenever things got tough, he would put his hand in his pocket and feel that flag and remember, right, I love this country. I'm here to cash in on the benefits of this country. And I believe that reconciliation is the goal of this country. But that's the attitude that changes. He grasped the ministry of reconciliation. And I think the challenge is for us to follow through now, today. Our job's not done. Our job's not done. And those of us who are believers should easily grasp that we're called to the ministry of reconciliation. We want to have those conversations like Pastor Crawford's having in his congregation, where he's having cops sit down with black teenagers and talk. Okay, what's going on? How have you been offended? What are you afraid of? What do I need to know? Let's talk about my prejudices and your prejudices, because they exist. Prejudices, all people have prejudices. People carrying the signs, people carrying the guns. Everybody's got prejudices. If you can sit down and be honest about what your narrative is, how were you raised, what are your prejudices, and I want to share that, and I'm honest with you with that, then we can come together to create that reconciliation that is still needed today. I think we've got an important task laid down before us, and I would like us to respond out of love, not shame.
Well, we have explored shame as being the core of our response mechanisms to defend our position, because if we give an inch, we're admitting to what it is we're being accused of, and we would rather be wrong and justified than to take responsibility for our error and find a way to reconcile it. We're talking with Dr. Mark Baker, author of Overcoming Shame, Let Go of Others' Expectation, and Embrace God's Acceptance. This is a model that's been given to us by a brilliant man and good friend of mine who has opened up my eyes to our shame center, to the very core of where trauma begins to bind up your bowels and your emotions and become something that Jesus came to bind up the brokenhearted and to set the captives free from the shame. Paul set free from, not that he's accomplished all this, but this he does. He forgets what's behind and presses on to the mark of the high calling, to the prize in Messiah. And all of us can do that by accepting God's plan of salvation, God's plan of reconciliation with him first, before we can reconcile ourselves to man. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to explore these psychological defense mechanisms that keep us from doing the right thing, because we're operating from a place of shame, and we're letting others push that shame button within us that makes us feel bad for what our ancestors, for what prior generations did, and for what we might have been taught in our own homes that we've allowed to foster, and we didn't do anything about it. We'll be right back.
With today's smartphone technology, news, information, sports, and entertainment is widely available and almost unbounded. But what about the information that believers in Yeshua are looking for? Well, now there's an app for that. Igniting a Nation now has apps available for Android and iPhone. With our app, you'll gain access to everything you would in our website, from our featured guests to our live streaming shows. Visit Google Play or the Apple Store and download Igniting a Nation's new app today.
Shalom, I'm Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation's Ministry. Our ministry is a teaching ministry, and through our television programs, Revealing the Truth, Revealing the Bible, and Revealing Prophecy, we share a wealth of information with you. We conduct in-person teachings around the state of Alabama every week. Over the course of the past 12 years, I've compiled an extraordinary library of sermons, teachings, video series, and commentaries that all bring a Jewish believer's perspective to the Bible. As a ministry, it's our desire that these teachings be made available to everyone. That is why we have created the Biblical Truth Library that allows you unlimited access to all of the audio and video teachings for a fraction of the cost. Imagine being able to study alongside a Messianic rabbi at your own pace and learn about prophecy, Islam, Judaism, Jesus' life, the prophetic significance of the Feast of Israel, and so much more for just a small monthly, quarterly, or annual subscription price. In addition, 2 new classes are added to the library every week. These teachings, if purchased individually, would cost over $3,000, But for as little as 50 cents a day, you can have unlimited access to every sermon, every teaching, every course, and learn at your own pace, and your access fee is tax deductible. You can watch on any smartphone, tablet, PC, or smart TV, and can start and pause the teaching at any time and start right back up when you are ready to continue. I want to personally invite you to explore the Biblical Truth Library and gain insights into the Scripture like you have never had before. Simply select the subscription option that's best for you. Visit ignitinganation.com and click on the Biblical Truth Library to start your learning journey with me today. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, and as we do on the second Friday of every month in the 12 o'clock Central Time hour, we meet with our good friend Dr. Mark Baker, author of Overcoming Shame, Let Go of Others' Expectations, and Embrace God's Acceptance, and You Can Change, a story from Angola prison that is just heart-moving, heart-rendering, and letting you know the power of God to transform even the most violent criminal. And as we're looking at these issues that we're facing, Mark, welcome back to this second half of the program. I want to talk about the psychological aspects of this in regards to the spiritual aspects of this. Now, the inner city church, the black church, which is a name that's bothered me until I went to the black community and said, what is the black church? Is that a bad thing? In the debate that went on, it was mentioned 3 times in the third debate, the black church, the black church, the black church. And I went to the leaders of the black church and said, is this a racist thing? I don't understand it. And they said, no. We are an entity. We are the inner city. We are the ones supporting. We are doing the work.
Yes.
And we understand the problems, and we're dealing with some of the core issues on the street that you, like you say, you admit, you came to us and say, I don't know how to interpret this statement. What is the black church? Why do we have that divide? Why do we have still African American? Why don't we just have American? Do we have to hyphenate everybody? Irish American, Italian American, Jewish American. Why is there distinctions, and are those the things that divide us? And I wanted to understand. I had a panel. I did a special on the black church, and I had leaders from the black community come in and educate our audience on what this term meant and what role it plays and why we need to not try to displace it and create another agenda, but to weigh into supporting and helping and assisting and partnering and being a part of that ministry into the community, because they talk the talk, walk the walk, and know the people and the needs of the community. The same way that the suburban pastors know the needs of the suburban community. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we need to acknowledge that the needs are different. So psychologically, and as believers, adding that component to the believer's psychology, which should be different than the non-believer's psychology, but yet we still have the same woundedness. We still have the same shame. We still have the same rage. We still have the same problems, believer or non-believer. But how do we process this and resolve? Because we're so prone to defend. Well, I've never done anything racist. I've never said anything. It's all about me. This whole issue is all about what I said or what I liked or what I didn't like. And that's not the case at all.
You know, that's a really interesting subject, the black church and the black community. I've spent quite a bit of time at the prison in Angola, the largest maximum security prison in the country. My last book was based on my experiences there, and I came to understand quite a bit about the black church and the black community, because there are disproportionately more blacks incarcerated than there are whites per percentage of the population, right? And one of the things we found out in looking into this and studying criminology was that the most powerful institution that we have to fight crime in this country today is the black church. What we have found is statistically, in the highest crime areas in this country, If there's a black church there, and if a black teenager goes to that black church, they've got an 80% less chance of getting involved in crime and getting arrested and going to jail. It's hugely powerful social changes going on in the black church in the most serious crime-ridden areas in our country. And it's not just because of what they're told not to do, like don't drink, don't smoke, don't chew, don't run with girls that do. I mean, that's not it. It's because of what they are getting that they don't want to give up. They're getting a life, a community, a connection with the community, a life in Christ, in God, a connection to something bigger than themselves that makes them feel loved and meaningful. And for many of these young men, a loving father figure in their life, a God that loves them, a father figure, they don't want to give that up. And what they're getting is so powerful that the temptations, the same drug temptations, the same crime temptations, the same temptations to drop out of school are not as attractive as what they're getting from the church. And that community part of it, that sense of connection, is a powerful, powerful piece of it. And what we also found is that when guys got out of prison and then went back into the community, if they didn't get plugged into a church, black church for most of them, recidivism kicked in, they went back to crime, they were back in jail again. Even Christians, even the guys who came to know Christ in prison, went back out, did not plug themselves back into the black church, they fell back into the crime, their old ways. Powerful, powerful institution, and they know it. And if you go to a black church, what you're going to hear eventually is, what's the problem here? Fathers, stay with your families. That's what you're going to hear from every pulpit. Your responsibility is to man up and you be a man in that family. They get it. They know what the problem is, and they know what the psychology that's needed in their community. And they're not encouraging their people to feel like victims and to believe that because of their skin color, they're never going to get anywhere in life. They're giving them solutions. You marry that girl, you stay with that girl. And there are opportunities that grow out of that. We know that if you graduate from high school before you have a kid, don't have a kid out of wedlock, and get a minimum wage job, you've got something like a 60% chance of lifting yourself out of poverty, no matter what the color of your skin is. We've done this research. We know this. And the black church, I believe, is a powerful, powerful social institution in our society today, because we're not there yet. I think you and I might have the ideal of thinking, well, why isn't there just the church? Well, I think we're still generations away from that. We'll always have that struggle, the struggle of prejudices and racism. But we're moving in the direction of reconciliation, because we have voices that are informed by the Word of God as to how to go about dealing with social problems. And it's through reconciliation, it's through family values, it's by us honoring the marriage vows, it's by raising our children with discipline, which isn't pleasant, but it's loving. We've got a guidebook here for how to deal with our social ills if we would just read it and listen to it. But psychology does get in the way. And just let me say a thing about defense mechanisms. I think probably the one we just talked about in the last segment that's the most important is that rage is a defense against shame. I think it's the big one we need to name. That someone screaming out in rage that things need to change is being triggered by something. That aggression, as I said earlier, is anger is energy to solve a problem. When it's solving a problem, when it's energy to solve a problem, then it's healthy anger and it's aggression, which we psychologically know to be a healthy thing. When it's rage, I don't know what the problem is, but everybody's bad and somebody's got to fix the solution. And I know you're bad. I don't just disagree with you. You're bad. That's rage as a defense against shame. That never solves the problem. We've got to back the truck up and figure out, okay, what's your trigger? What's the shame here that's causing you to rage blindly at the other side? And both sides are doing this. What's the trigger, your personal shame that's being triggered? What's your personal trauma that's unhealed? And Bessel van der Kolk, who's the nation's expert on trauma, who developed the PTSD diagnosis, says that for him, one of the biggest problems in helping PTSD victims get better is shame. The shame they feel over being a victim of trauma. makes them believe they are a victim. And that shame gets wound up in the trauma and makes them not want to talk about it. Shame wants to hide. Shame wants to put the pain under a rock and then rage about it, because rage gives me the illusion of power. I have no weakness here. I'm powerful, and my rage is a defense against unhealed shame. And we as a society have got to grasp that notion so that we can dial down the conversation, stop saying things like the violence is justified. No, that you're distracting from the solution. Let's sit down and talk about what's really wrong. Racism does exist. Yes, it exists. Prejudices exist. Yes, it does. Inequality exists. Economic diversity exists. Let's sit down and talk about what are those solutions. What are we doing that's hurting? The economist Thomas Sowell has written books on this, on how the well-meaning efforts of our country to provide social welfare for the black community has actually robbed them of the family stability. After social welfare programs kicked in, or before they kicked in, the black family was a relatively intact unit. Marriages were pretty stable. It was like something like 60, 70, 80% of black families, dad was in the home. 4 decades later, what we've got is 70% are single moms trying to raise their kids. And he believes some of the stuff we are trying to do to help is hurting. So we need to sit down and have honest conversations about what our solutions are to the racism and the discrimination that still is going on today. And we need to stop defending ourselves, like you said, justifying ourselves, which blinds us to the solution. The solution has to do with me vulnerably looking at my own wounds, my own shame, my own trauma, my own prejudices, and then us having a conversation about what we think the solutions might be, not just vilifying sides out of a defense mechanism of projection. Like if I feel angry and I really am so mad at you that I really feel like you should be hurt, then I'm projecting onto you that that's what you're doing to me. You're just hurting me, and you have ill intent here. And if I can stop with the psychological defense mechanisms, take our walls down, then we can engage in a ministry of reconciliation, which I believe is the only way we're going to heal this, not through twisting the other person's arm into agreement. You can change behavior legislatively. You can change heart only through reconciliation. We're in the heart part now. Mm-hmm. This is, and Nelson Mandela said this. He said, what's more difficult than changing society is changing yourself. He just put his finger on the problem. That's where we're at. We're in the age of changing ourselves now. We still have these problems, but we've got to be vulnerable, honest, self-reflective, stop projecting, stop denying, stop raging, and be vulnerable with our shame in order for us to have that ministry of reconciliation that is so needed in our world today. It's desperately needed.
Amen. We've been talking with Dr. Mark Baker, author of Overcoming Shame, Let Go of Others' Expectations, and Embrace God's Acceptance. Is shame at the core of what's going on in America today and around the world over the persecution of one people group by the hands of another people group, and to one belief system over another belief system, whether it's Christian persecution, whether it's racial persecution, whether or not it's division of any kind? A house divided against itself cannot stand, and Satan only wins if he distracts you from the cause of God. And all you have to do is take your eyes off the mark and you miss the target. And God has a message for us in this season that we are called into a ministry of reconciliation. We, as the body of Messiah, have a responsibility to heaven to be ambassadors for God, as if God were speaking through us the same way Jesus spoke when he walked this earth. He didn't tolerate mistreatment. He didn't tolerate inhumanity. He didn't tolerate the subjugation. He even said, call no man master, for you have but one master. And this is a message for our time, that we understand that we are to be harbingers of healing and ministers of reconciliation. We are to be a heart of compassion, to let no unwholesome talk come from our mouth, but only that which for the benefit, for the uplifting, for the encouragement of another, and those within the hearing. that when we're given the pulpit, when we're given the microphone, we're not supposed to incite to riot. We're supposed to provoke to jealousy for the peace that we have, even in the face of adversity, for the hope. 1 Peter 3:15, the hope that burns. We have a reason, an answer, ready answer for the hope that burns within us. Not in Jesus dying on the cross, but in his return to bring peace to this very broken world. But in the meantime, he has us as his ambassadors, and we need to step up as the body of Messiah and take on the responsibility to bring healing to a broken nation, to a broken people, to a broken world. And there is still time for us to do the work we were assigned with. Don't let shame hold you back from fulfilling your calling in Messiah. Dr. Mark Baker, always just moving when you and I are together. I so appreciate you.
It's always great.
God bless
Thank
you, my
you.
friend. Thank you.
God bless you.
We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.